Yeah. Hi everyone. Welcome to the first episode of WIF Vichaar. I'm Aryan Aneja, and today we have a very special guest with us today. It is Mr. Nikhil Pahwa. How are you doing?
Very well, Aryan. I'm doing as well as anyone can be in these circumstances. We're all in lockdown, all in isolation. But I guess this is a time to look at things a lot more closely than
hmm
we otherwise would have. So we are overworked and trying to do whatever we can to figure out what's happening in the tech and tech policy space, both in India and globally, because, you know, as I say,
Yeah.
unprecedented times have called for unprecedented measures. So life has become a lot more interesting and fun.
Yes, for sure. So, for those who don't know, Mr. Pahwa is the founder of Medianama.com, as you can see from his T-shirt, and he is a TED fellow, and most famously, he is the co-founder of SaveTheInternet.in. So with Medianama, as he said, he's a tech journalist. He's been writing about tech policy for a long time. But especially with Save the Internet, that's how I got familiar with Mr. Pahwa as well. Is he's been a digital rights activist. He was at the forefront when talking about net neutrality in India, and I believe you led a partnership with AIB, like one of the most successful campaigns, I think, a grassroots campaign
Yeah.
essentially, which led a lot of messages being sent to the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India, and India having like one of the bestest of laws regarding net neutrality eventually.
We have the strongest net neutrality regulations in the world, and that's because we had 1.2 million people participating in a public consultation for the first time in India's history. So that is the largest campaign till date, and I I hope to see it getting better at some point in time because we sure as hell need it.
Yeah, for sure. So today, however, we will be unable to talk about Save the Internet, as interesting as that is, but we will be focusing something that is much more recent, which is the current crisis that's going on. That is the COVID-19 crisis. And as you can imagine, and as with everything in the world today, this crisis has a certain tech aspect to it as well, something that Mr. Pahwa is quite closely involved with. So let's address this straight on. What is contact tracing and how does it affect us?
So I think contact tracing comes from understanding how contagious diseases spread and how they are dealt with.
Mm-hmm.
So historically, what's happened is that, let's say, in case of either HIV or in case of Ebola, in case of perhaps even the plague, what had happened was that when people, because it's contagious, way to address the spread of contagion is to go from person to person, almost like a, because everyone's separated by 6 degrees, to go from person to person and figure out who's been in contact with the person who has it first.
Mm-hmm.
So there's always a patient zero in many of these cases. And then it goes from, and then there's an exponential progression of the spread of the disease. So contact tracing is a method to identify who's been in contact and therefore ask them to come for getting tested and getting isolated or hospitalized and cured. Now, the current situation has led to the usage of technology because I think we're in an era of tech solutionism where everyone feels that technology is the solution to our problems. And technologists have done what technologists do. They've built contact tracing apps and trying to figure out who's been in contact with whom. Now, the problem with some of this is that that data gets collected and stored, and how it gets stored, how it gets used is perhaps something that we can go into in more detail. But
Mm-hmm.
essentially, how it works is that, let's say, if two phones are in proximity, if you're running the app, then your Bluetooth is on.
Mm-hmm.
And Bluetooth has a range of, I mean, anything from 5 to 10 meters, and this uses Bluetooth low energy. And it's sort of, if your Bluetooth device, if that Bluetooth range comes in my Bluetooth range, then they exchange IDs. So that
Mm-hmm.
indicates that the two of us have been in contact.
Yeah.
Now, with COVID-19, what we understand is that it's about 2 to 2.5 meters, or 2 to 2.5 feet, that maybe someone sneezes, that contagion can spread. In this case, it's basically it could be a radius of 20 meters or something. So, but still, it indicates that one person has been in the proximity of another person, and it notes that information down on each other's phones. And depending on which contact tracing app you're using in which part of the world, that data is either stored on your device or it is sent to a centralized server. And if either one of us tests positive, then the other person gets a notification saying, hey, someone you've been in contact with has tested positive, so please go and get yourself checked. And so it's more of an exposure notification that you might have been affected, and it's asking you to go and get yourself tested. Now, what India has done differently is that it's also added location data to this. So the Indian app is called Aarogya Setu. It now has probably the highest reach of any contact tracing app in the world. It has about 94 million users. And that's because the government has mandated its usage. So India has about 500 odd million internet users. And so if every one of them starts using it, then we can expect this to be upwards of 400 million if indeed it is successful, right? So, so that spread can, what's happening is that people have to also share the location information, and then the government uses that to identify whether you are in a risky spot or not. And also it marks if people in a particular zone or a particular area test positive, then they mark that area as sensitive, and they might look at doing disinfection, or they might look at getting more people tested or converting it, as we are seeing, from a green zone to an orange zone or to a red zone, where you have different government norms for stepping out of homes, and different activities are possible or not possible. So contact tracing is a means for the government to perhaps be able to understand what to lock down, what not to lock down, but also inform people that they need to get themselves tested.
So I believe you talked a little bit about different countries having different approaches towards contact tracing apps, and India specifically with Aarogya Setu going for an approach which perhaps also stores location. Why is that? Why do you think the Indian government thinks it's necessary to store location while not all countries think it's necessary? And my second question is, what do you mean when you say, oh, it's stored in a centralized server versus when it is stored, it is decentralized?
So in case of, could you repeat your first question, please, again?
Yeah, sure. So essentially my question is that why do you think the Indian government went for an approach which takes in both location services and Bluetooth instead of just going for Bluetooth?
So look, this app was developed in a matter of 10-12 days. It was rolled out on April 12th. And I think at that point in time, there weren't many other apps, and there wasn't much of a discussion on what is the ideal way of doing this. So I'm not sure about how much of thought went into whether there should be location tracking or not. But the Indian government historically has a propensity to collect more data than is actually needed. Data minimization is not one of the strongest points or approaches. And so they are looking to collect this location information. Funnily enough, people who use this app are often under the misapprehension that the moment you come close to someone who is infected, you will get a notification that you're near someone who's infected. That doesn't actually happen. What it does give you is that maybe in a 1 kilometer, 2 kilometer, 500 meter radius, it tells you how many people have tested positive, how many people have perhaps downloaded Aarogya Setu, how many people have given the self-assessment test. And that's again something that the location information is possibly used for.
I think that's quite interesting. So it just gives them an aggregate view. So from what I gather, you're not a huge fan of them collecting so much information. So why do you think collecting so much information could be a problem? And why do you think, like, why should I be wary of the government having my location data? Like, isn't it all right? Because at the end of the day, they're trying to save people's lives. So the more information they have, the better they'll be able to do that job.
Yeah. So I think that for many of us, the sort of philosophical challenges that we're trying to balance individual privacy against the health of an entire population. And
Mm-hmm.
so these are exceptional circumstances, and there is a state of exception being put into place in many countries with a lockdown, etc., etc. Now, the question is that should we have an all or nothing scenario? Should we have privacy, or when there is no exceptional situation, and should we have absolutely no privacy at all when there isn't one, when there is a state of exception? And I think that all or nothing approach is a flawed one, because you can have basic norms in place to protect an individual's privacy. So let's take the Indian app because I know that best. It has a fairly decent privacy policy and a fairly useful approach when it comes to protecting user information. But that itself has its own challenges. So, firstly, it takes when it collects your personal information, when you have to fill out a form when you install it, it sends that information to the centralized server with a unique digital ID that's linked to your app. Now, what they've done is that they have a unique static ID, whereas what many governments, including Singapore's government, or even, for example, Google and Apple's initiatives in that direction do is that they use a dynamic ID so that no, if an ID of the database gets compromised, they're not able to identify it down to a single individual.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing is that there are also with the any app that collects your location data all the time and figures out who you have been in proximity to all the time, effectively violates your privacy. Let's make no bones about it. That is surveillance. Now the question is, what kind of surveillance is okay now and what isn't? So what is the utility of location information apart from just figuring out what a hotspot might be? And that depends on the efficacy of the self-assessment test which the app has, which requires you to put in your details about how you are feeling. Now, anyone that's afraid of statutory power or afraid of the government is likely to put in false information or just to show that they're green on the app so that they can roam around. And so the efficacy of the test itself is questionable, and therefore the efficacy of marking a zone as red or green is again questionable. This location data need not be collected. You need data minimization principles in place. Even though once the data is typically only sent to the server once you test positive, but also with the device IDs or the digital IDs of the people you've been in contact with, and they are informed. The data is cleaned from your device every 30 days, and the data is supposedly cleaned from the server every 45 days. So the privacy policy looks sorted, but the problem is that we don't know. And there is no way of testing whether this actually works or not because they haven't open sourced the app. So security researchers cannot actually test this app through penetration testing. They can't test what amount of data is being sent to the servers, whether there's more information in the digital ID that is exchanged. So unless there's transparency, there can't be accountability here. And the Indian government's been remarkably, hesitant to open source the app. The other challenge really is that there is a scope creep taking place. So there are more services that are being added onto this. Look, many governments, including India's, like to think of themselves as platforms, that they are service providers to citizens. And India information taking place over the last 6 to 7 years, especially with Aadhaar, our digital ID project, and all the services that are being linked to it, and the way Aadhaar was mandated for many services. Now, when you get an install base, any company, any government, when they get an install base of almost 100 million for an app, I don't think there's a possibility that they'll let go of it once the crisis is over, right? And so there is, and they'll use that opportunity to add more and more government services to the app because that's how people think that now that you have an install base, let's try and see what else we can use this install base for. And so there's other data collection that is possible. Now we have no clarity on whether that data is linked to this sensitive data or not, whether it's linked to health data, which is very sensitive. And there has been no, and there is this constant move to add more and more things to it. So an e-pass, which allows you to move into certain areas, that functionality was added, and that effectively means that someone had to give their ID proof to the government in order to get an e-pass. So, and one level you have anonymization within the same app, and another level you have verification of an ID taking place linked to that same app. So how delinked are these data sets? We don't know. There's also been a little bit of evasiveness or lack of clarity in terms of who exactly gets access to the data. So the privacy policy says that the data will be accessed only by government executives or officials for the purpose of dealing with COVID-19. Now, the privacy policy might say that, but how do you know? Where is the accountability? Who holds them accountable? So I think there's a gap between what is promised in the privacy policy and the ability for people to check whether that's the case or not. Like even today, we don't know which is the nodal authority responsible for monitoring this data and its usage. And let's say if there's a data leak, like we've seen in India over many years. In fact, even with Aarogya Setu, there was a vulnerability which the government itself spoke about recently, where the data was being given to Google. Who do we hold accountable for it? And so that accountability is a major concern, and that happened with Aadhaar as well. The privacy policy, the terms and conditions actually say that the government is not responsible for any data leaks or even the efficacy of the data. And so therefore you can't take them to court. And now these terms of service might be acting as if it is voluntary, but on the street, what you see is that it's being made mandated. So Noida, which is a suburb of Delhi, essentially the police there mandated it and threatened arrest for people who don't have the app. In another district in the state of Uttar Pradesh, it was mandated that people download it. Many employers have mandated it, and the government, in fact, has issued a notification that forces employers to force employees to download it. So it's no longer voluntary, and it's increasingly an act. It's being policed whether you have it or not. I just got a message from a friend who said that the hospital, he'd have to take his mother for treatment, and the hospital wouldn't let him enter unless he had the app. So people are being forced to download it, and in that situation, there needs to be an environment of trust, an environment of accountability, and tighter controls. My friend doesn't want to download the app, so he sought a solution from me. But I guess the only solution that some of us can afford is not to step out so that we can't be checked whether we have the app or not.
So, and I think the problem is further compounded by the fact, like as you mentioned, that India has about 400 million internet users, but we have a population of 1.2 billion. So mandating the app necessary would also mean you're excluding 800 million people. And I'm sure that's already the case with a lot of private employers, for example, that a lot of their employees might not just have smartphones and might be too much of an ask.
Yeah.
It's
not just that. Sure. So it's not just that. It's the fact that the efficacy of the solution is not very clear. So, for example, if you look at Bluetooth, if it doesn't recognize the fact that there might be a wall in between two people. So in an apartment complex where there are multiple people on multiple floors, it's still operating on a radius of 10 meters. And so two people on different floors who haven't met each other can still be shown as having been in contact. In the same way, like I mentioned earlier, that people can fake their health status in the app. And so the efficacy and the usefulness is not very clear. There is nothing that indicates that these apps are going to be useful in this process. So this is the only thing that you can do with technology. Whereas what's really worked in places is a large amount of testing for people. Apps will not solve the problem.
Hmm. So I believe one of the most successful models that we've seen for COVID-19 is in South Korea. And in South Korea, they had a really successful model where they had a lot of testing, really a high number of testing, but they also had some amount of contact tracing, but without an application. So how did that work out?
So I'm not quite sure of how South Korea did it, but again, that would probably be on in terms of a manual contact tracing survey that you ask people to tell who they've been in contact with. Just also remember, um, Southeast Asian countries, including South Korea and Singapore, have been through either the MERS or the SARS viruses, and so they have very established protocols for these situations. So you have a red alert, you have an orange alert, and so people know how to behave in those situations, and people tend to follow the rules. Even though there is a clear risk of infection, um, the moment India opened up its lockdown and liquor stores were allowed to function, you saw queues of of multiple kilometers and people braving the sun to get their liquor, but also not keeping social distancing. And so, I don't think India knows the risks that, or people themselves at an individual level realize the risks that they are taking. In fact, in many instances, when I'd gone grocery shopping, and there were circles that were marked for people to keep distance, half the time you had to keep telling people to get in line and stay away, because they just don't follow the rules. And so I think, look, the contact tracing also works when there is, before the stage of community spread, where it's only going from one person to a few. The moment it's a full blown community spread where it's spreading from hundreds of people to hundreds of people, contact tracing is not going to help. Testing is. I think we are while they say that India isn't in that stage yet. I don't think we're testing enough to realize how big the numbers are, which is why you're seeing the numbers increase rapidly every single day. Um, and I think this is going to continue. You'll probably see an escalation now that the lockdown's been opened. And then you'll probably have another lockdown in place once the numbers are high. And so the risks are very high, and contact tracing is just, to my mind, distracting people from real work, which is, um, getting enough tests, getting enough PPE to protect those who are conducting those tests, and being in lockdown and ensuring that enough people are tested, in each zone in each area.
Hmm. That's actually a lot for us to think about. Just circling back to a point you made earlier about, say, Aadhaar. So, just for people who don't know, Aadhaar is a program that the Indian government started way back in around 2013-ish, where they had a number of data points collected. For example, your fingerprint data, your biometrics, your iris data, etc. And it was a way for them to have a common platform where each and every person had an identity card, and eventually it was made compulsory for different things. But one of the problems we've had with Aadhaar, again, as Mr. Pahwa pointed out, is that the amount of data, the way it is stored, even though the privacy policy might say otherwise, it's not necessarily that secure. And we've had a lot of data leaks, even with the COVID-19 crisis, for example. I believe the Rajkot government recently just leaked out everyone's names, addresses, etc., just to tell them, oh, all of these people are COVID-19 positive. So, do you think there is a sense of a lack of respect for people's data in India? And also, is that somehow related to the entire debate we have been having about right to privacy?
So look, I think, if you look at the Indian government and the Indian police and the way they operate, they're largely feudal in their approach. They think of themselves as rulers and as people as subjects, rather than citizens. And so there is always a heavy hand of the state, in that's trying to control the situation, which is why, there is very little regard for individual rights, because they look at everything from a mob control or a population control perspective rather than, protecting individual rights. Let's not forget the Indian government had gone to the Supreme Court and argued that privacy isn't a fundamental right. They lost that battle in the Supreme Court, and it was a landmark 9-0 judgment. But still, they tend to operate as if that judgment never happened, which is why we still don't have a privacy law in place. But also, you've seen vast amounts of data being published and sensitive data being collected. So, for example, Karnataka for a while had for people in quarantine, they had an app that was specifically created where those in quarantine had to upload a selfie every hour. And there are currently, just to maintain the lockdown, there are drones in operation that are taking video footage of individuals, and the police is publishing some of that drone footage online where people are identifiable. There have been lists of quarantine patients that have been circulating on WhatsApp that have obviously come from government departments. There was a list of names and addresses and age of people in my neighborhood that were circulating within our neighborhood groups that looked like an official list. So I think people that the government officials themselves don't really have much respect for privacy because they're trying to subjugate the subjects in a sense and keep them in check. We saw something similar with houses being marked with stickers, and those people are effectively prone to some kind of discrimination going forward. So what is the value of publishing this data? That's not very clear. And we saw something exactly the same with Aadhaar, where for weeks and months, different government departments were publishing personal information, including names, addresses, phone numbers, and Aadhaar numbers in Excel sheets on their websites, which were indexed on Google search. So, I mean, the similarities between what happened with Aadhaar and what's happening with Aarogya Setu are stark. First is this leakage of information. Second is this notion that it is voluntary but mandatory. Third is this idea of tech solutionism that doesn't necessarily solve the problem, which was also the case with Aadhaar. So, you are also people's blind belief in these technology tools as being a solution, and complete disregard for privacy, treating privacy as an elitist concern as opposed to an individual's right. Even though that was debunked by the Supreme Court when the Supreme Court said that it is a part of your fundamental right and it needs to be preserved by the state. And in fact, the poor actually have less choice. They are being forced to part with their data for basically getting food and rations. It is in fact the elites who have that choice because they can choose not to take government subsidies or not to take certain liberties that they enjoy because they can afford it. So we are going to this elitist example is I've heard it quite often over the last week that only the elites are concerned about privacy, but in fact I would say everyone's concerned about privacy. It's just that the elites have a choice and the voice to speak up against privacy violations. And if we enjoy rights like privacy, I think it's our responsibility to ensure that others also get to enjoy it. It can't be a false binary between having privacy and having food, or having a job and having Aarogya Setu, right? Because or getting medical attention in a hospital and having Aarogya Setu or Aadhaar. These are one should not be contingent on the other.
Mm-hmm. And I think we've taken a lot of your time, and these are really, really important points, and it's really sombering to hear that there are so many problems we have currently in our country, specifically regarding digital rights. But at its core, yes.
Aryan, I have a list of suggestions that I've put together in terms of norms from a privacy perspective. If I can take a couple of minutes,
that would be
rush to them, right? So, in order to preserve privacy, even in these states of exceptional time, here's how data needs to be dealt with. And this is from a discussion that we held a couple of weeks ago at Medianama and these are inputs that were given by our speakers. Number one, anonymize the data early. Choose data minimization, only collect what you need. Have a proportionate approach to this data collection. So what you're collecting from where needs to be necessary and only exactly how much you need. Have a purpose specification. So it should be for the purpose for which the data is collected. Have a limitation on sharing the data to control which government departments or which areas that data can be shared with, and who gets, and most importantly, define which individuals have access to that data. That access must be documented and have a review mechanism in place for it. Have principles of non-discrimination in place. Ideally, have a separate law for something that's as violative of privacy as this is, in order to control it. In these cases, like Singapore has done, have a temporary legislation in place. Perhaps even have a temporary regulatory body in place which can give recommendations related to protecting privacy to people who may not be that concerned, who are creating these apps. And most importantly, do not take a centralized approach. There is no need for this data to be going to a centralized government server where it is at risk, as opposed to staying on the phone, and only when you test positive, a ping can go to your phone that can inform your contacts that a contact of yours has been infected, so you should get yourself tested. The government having this data makes absolutely no sense. And lastly, and most importantly, given that this is a significant violation of an individual's privacy, there must be a sunset date. I understand that there is no end to the COVID crisis as we know it right now, but that sunset date can be revised as well. So there can be, so this app should stop. Unlike in case of what the Indian government has said, that it may continue for 1 to 2 years and they might expand it to include other services. So those are our suggestions on what to do to maintain privacy and yet have some amount of contact tracing that might be necessary.
These are all really good suggestions, and I think at its core, it's quite important for all of us to understand that privacy, again, as you correctly pointed out, is not just a rich man's worry. It's something that everyone should be worried about, and like even the Supreme Court pointed out, like it is a right. You have a right to privacy. So at the end of the day, even though it's quite sad to see the state of affairs for now, I think all of us are extremely happy to have digital right activists like yourself who like at the forefront and who are fighting for this. I think at the end, if you guys, so if you guys are interested, you should definitely check out Medianama.com, where we can see more of your work. And also, I believe you recently gave a talk with TEDx, which was extremely interesting and extremely eye-opening for me. So yeah, I definitely recommend for you to check out more of Mr. Pahwa's work. Thank you.
Thanks, Aarogya. Thanks for having me on.